Chapter 2 The Doppelganger The probe lay encased in mud halfway down a hillside. The once silvery sides were battered and scorched from the long fall through the atmosphere. Drying streamers of black earth coated the dented sides. Ghostly heat waves shimmered, and the metallic hull ticked as it cooled and contracted. The echoes of its landing reverberated for a long time among the hills. Inside the abused shell, timed relays opened and fed power to the positronic circuitry of the robot nestled in its protective cradle. The neophyte mind found itself in total darkness. Had it been a living creature, its birth instincts would have taken over like a sea turtle, burrowing from the wet sand to fight the shimmering sea. The robot had its own instinct analog, the 3 laws of robotics. Knowledge of these basic rules flooded the robot's brightening awareness. First law: a robot may not harm a human being, or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. Second law: a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Third law: a robot must protect its existence as long as such protection does not interfere with the first or second laws. This was the manner in which most of known human space defined the laws. Any schoolchild of Aurora or Earth or Solaris could recite them by rote. But to the fledgling there was one important, essential difference. To the fledgling there were no words involved, only deep core compulsions. The fledgling had no sense that it had been built, or that it was merely a constructed machine. It did not think of itself as a robot. It only knew that it had certain instructions it must obey. As survival instinct, the law were enough to spark a response. Second law governed the fledgling's first reactions, enhanced by third law resonance. There were imperious voices in its mind, inbuilt programming, speaking a language it knew instinctively. The robot followed the instructions given it, and more circuits opened. An opening appeared in the probe's hull, and the fledgling allowed itself to roll out. The skin of its body shimmered, the myriad decahedral segments flexing and shifting as it stretched like a warm putty. The robot extruded pseudopods to stabilize the round body. Sensory input was taken in through the skin: optical, auditory, tactile, scent. At the same time, a larger store of basic files were released into the receptive mind. A heavily edited encyclopedia of carefully chosen knowledge. It paused, searching the programming as it absorbed impressions of its surroundings. A voice whispered, "Move away from the landing site. Beings may come to investigate. They may be aggressive and dangerous. Hide!" Which left the problem: how to move. The positronic brain searched the files and found an answer. The skin molded itself further, the pseudopods becoming muscular legs. The robot scuttled away quickly, moving uphill to a stand of course, tall grass. Its round body flattened, the legs retracted. It hunkered down, patient. As it waited, it inventoried itself dispassionately. The 3 laws overlaid everything else in its mind, but there was more. Most of its programming, and indeed this very self-evaluation, seemed to be manifestations of the 3rd law. It must protect its own existence. To survive, it must learn as much as possible. Underneath the laws was the layer of initial programming, most of which the fledgling had already followed in the first few minutes of life. Beneath that was a substrate of complex if-then branches. The robot ignored most of those. They all fed back into the laws in any case. Only one set of impulses was immediately needed, and that flowed directly from the laws. A robot may not harm a human being. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings. The laws insisted. But what was a human being? The programming gave an answer, not a definition, but a description. A human being is an intelligent life form. So the fledgling, not knowing what a robot was other than a term that applied to itself, knew it had to find human beings. To protect and serve them, it had to search out an intelligent life form. It began to formulate a strategy. The fledgling didn't move. It continued to wait. Intelligence of necessity implied curiosity. An intelligent life form in the immediate area would have seen the fiery, noisy descent. It would come to investigate the fall. If no life that met the criterion arrived, then the fledgling would look elsewhere. The area in which the probe had landed was heavily forested. Tightly packed trees with large blue-green fronds huddled nearby and surrounded the grassy hillside meadow. The area was alive with sound now, and the robot could see movement in the twilight under the swaying canopy of leaves. The air was temperate and fragrant with damp earth. The sound of running water trilled not far away. This was a good place, the robot decided. Human beings, whatever they might be, would probably find this location pleasant. Had they come here, they might well have stayed. Afternoon faded to evening. The robot saw several creatures on the hillside, but none displayed any undue interest in the pod. Once something with a thin, furred body approached. On muscular hind legs it stretched out a long four-fingered hand to touch the pod. And the robot saw a marsupial pouch on its stomach. Though the versatile hand had made the robot watch closely, the creature did nothing to reveal more than animal intelligence. It wore no clothing, had no tools, and the robot's sensitive hearing recorded only meaningless grunts from the beast. The marsupial glanced round with wide, scarlet-pupilled eyes, nostril slits flapping on its wide, flat head. Then it went back down on all fours and bounded off. The fledgling decided not to follow. Not yet. Nightfall came with a surprising quickness after the sun slipped behind the trees. The air temperature dropped as rapidly. The forest settled into relative quiet as the nocturnal creatures woke and began to prowl. The night was well lit. The larger of the two moons was full. The smaller, at 3/4, rose not long after full night. Somewhere under the trees a series of coughing barks rose, long and highly modulated. The robot began to listen closely as the call came again, slightly changed. Another voice answered the first, shorter and deeper, then yet another, followed by a shivering howl. The intonations were complex and varied, yet obviously from the same species. Already the fledgling had identified repetitive syllables in the phrases. Twin shadow creatures moved under the margins of the trees, sleek and fast. The fledgling counted 5 of them, though more may have been lurking farther back in the forest. One of the pack broke away from the group, moving into moonlight. The creature was caninoid. At least, it came closest to matching the type in the inbuilt files of the robot's brain. That meant little in itself. There was nothing in the robot's programmed knowledge that said a human being could not be canine. Standing on 4 legs, the animal stood a meter from shoulder to ground, powerfully built and broad-chested. The fur was mottled gray and black, glossy with silvered tips. The head was short-muzzled and round, with a large skull and wide-set, light eyes. The tail was long and furless. It looked nearly prehensile. As the robot watched, the creature howled again as if in challenge, revealing molars set well back behind a double rank of incisors. An omnivore, possibly, not strictly a meat-eater. The front legs ended in a clawed paw, but the toe fingers were long, separate, and articulated, with a definite closing thumbs for grasping. The thick-elbowed joints seemed capable of a wide range of motion. It stared at the pod gleaming in doubled moonlight. It reared up on its hind legs, a female, the robot noted. With a stabbing motion of her front paw she gestured, a wave. Moonlight glinted on something on the creature's chest, and the fledgling adjusted its vision to see the thing more clearly. A long curved bang, hanging on a string of braided vine. Artifact! The word screamed in the fledgling's mind, but she continued to wait. 4 others came out of the covert of the trees now. 1 gray-furred ancient, 2 adults, and a youngling. They moved swiftly to the side of the first, but carefully stayed behind her. The adults paced, restless. The ancient jabbered, half bark, half growl. The leader shook her head. The old one barked again, and the leader turned with a growl, showing her teeth. She cuffed at the old one, but the raking claws missed as the elder cowered back, and lifted her muzzle to bare the throat in submission. The leader turned her back on the others and stared again at the pod. She approached the crumpled metal, snuffling. She sat before it. The tail served as support, and its agile tip curled around the back feet. The creature cocked her head to one side, then the other. She sniffed again, leaning closer to the pod, then reached out with her left paw. Talons clicked on metal. She tapped the surface, listening to the faint hollow ringing. What she did next made synapses open in the robot's postronic mind. The tail flicked and curled around a small stick on the ground near the pod. The stick was brought up. She took it in her paw, clasped it between the thumb and two fingers. Leaning forward, she placed the tip of the stick under a torn flap of metal and levered up a strand of foil insulation. She pulled it loose and sat back to examine it, letting the stick drop. Tool use, coupled with the intricate language, the necklace the leader wore, and their curiosity about the probe, that was enough evidence. They were intelligent. That also meant they were human beings. With that decision, the uniformed body of the fledgling began to take on definite shape, as if unseen hands were molding clay while using the creatures before it as models. First, the basic wolf-like shape, the muscular leanness. The head extruded, rounded, then pushed out the snout of a nose, and the flaps of ears. Fixed optical lenses focused in inset eye sockets, colored the same startling ice blue. It could not fully imitate fur, but the surface texture roughened, and the reflective patterns altered so that it displayed a vaguely similar silver gray and black pattern. After a moment of pondering, the robot also mimicked the secondary sexual characteristics of the leader. The behavior of the leader suggested that scent was an important sense to them. That was simple enough. A quick sampling of the leader's pheromones, and tiny artificial glands secreted an artificial wolf scent. A gentle breeze was blowing down slope. The leader raised her head suddenly. She went down on all fours, her lips drew back to bare the dangerous fangs. She growled, staring up the hill to the stand of grass where the robot waited. The robot stepped out to meet them. At the same time, without warning, the leader howled and charged. The wolf creature's attack. Chapter 3. Initiate. The wolf creature's attack was maddeningly swift, but the fledgling reflexes were still faster. She had no time to retreat, only to react. The third law compelled the robot to move so as to protect herself, while the first law stopped her from harming the wolf creature in return. As the snarling leader leapt toward the robot, the fledgling rolled so that her powerful jaws snapped shut on air, and the claws barely touched the metallic body. Even so, the force of the blow sent the robot flailing in the dirt before she found her balance again. The fledgling bounded to her feet, turning, but the leader, strangely, hadn't followed up her advantage. Crouching, the wolf creature bared her teeth once more at the robot, and uttered a quick growl that was obviously a command. The second law demanded that a human being be obeyed, and the fledgling had made the decision that the creatures were human. Yet without understanding the language, she could only guess as to what was being said. She remembered how the leader had challenged the old one in the pack. She patterned her behavior after the ancients. She bared her throat submissively and backed away. The ploy worked. The leader sniffed again, growling softly deep in her throat, and turned. She padded down the hill without looking back. Halfway to her followers, she stopped and glared up the slope to the fledgling, standing motionless under the twin moons. The robot took a step in the leader's direction. The human turned once again and continued on down the hill. The invitation was clear. It seemed more dangerous to ignore her than to follow. So the robot did, imitating the leader's silent, fluid gait. Once the leader approached the other wolf creatures again, the pack reformed. The body language and demeanor of the others told the robot that an established pecking order denoted precedence within the pack. There was a well-defined hierarchy in which a newcomer, by all indications, took the lowest rung. Even the juveniles bared teeth as the fledgling approached, and she hung well back as the leader barked commands. The wolf creature turned as one and slid quickly back under the cover of moonlit trees. The fledgling followed closely behind. Under the trees the pack moved quietly and furtively. They had obviously been interrupted in the middle of a hunt. Just inside the trees 3 young wolf creatures waited for them. A flint knife hung from each of their necks, and they were yoked to primitive travoy, long poles of dead branches lashed together with vines. The travoy held the fragrant, butchered carcasses of dead animals. Each bump caused a cloud of black insects to rise from the meat. The fledgling stayed with the pack easily. Somehow it felt right to be moving this way under the double shadows beneath the slow rustling of the leaves. Having decided the wolf creatures were human, her mind was already adopting their patterns as correct. The youngest of the juvenile carriers slackened his pace not long after they left the clearing of the pod, dropping back until he was abreast of the fledgling with his burden. He made an inquisitive soft bark as they ran behind the others. When the fledgling didn't answer, he repeated the sound. He was obviously waiting for a response, yet the fledgling had no idea what was appropriate. She knew only one language, that of the words inside her head. She could give names to the things she saw around her, could even speak them aloud if she wished. She gave no thought to where the language came from, it simply was. The problem was translation. Change her language into the words these creatures used. She knew that once she got them to talk, she would quickly acquire a vocabulary. The robotic memory would forget nothing it heard. The postronic intelligence would discover syntax and grammar rapidly. But without input there was only a void. A void was dangerous to her, and that was anathema to the third law. If she understood them and if she could communicate easily, there would be a lessening of danger. She had to make them speak enough for her to start acquiring the knowledge she needed. The adolescent was waiting for her response, staring at her as he pulled the travoy through the quiet woods. The fledgling did what her programming decided was the highest percentage action. She imitated the sound the young male had made. The effect was not what she desired. The youngster glared at her with a rolling of pastel blue eyes, sniffed disgustedly, and increased his pace to put distance between herself and the robot. She let him go. For a long time they wound their way through the paths of the forest. The largest moon had set before the leader came to a halt, deep in the forest and several kilometers from the landing site. The forest had gone dark and tangled. Large vines spun leafy webbings from the trees. The underbrush was thick and prickled with thorns. A cold dew frothed the edges of leaves, sparkling in the blue-white gleam of the remaining moon and spilling down on the pack from above. The fur of the wolf creatures was beaded with it. The leader prowled the edges of the clearing as the others sat on their haunches, tongues lolling and their breath steaming in the night air. The fledgling imitated them, watching as the robot sniffed the air in evident agitation. The robot sampled the air. There was the faint trace of a bitter animal scent below that of the wolf creatures and their kill. Nearby, a mass of white-winged moths spiraled and danced in the shaft of moonlight. A sloth-like creature capered down the pathway of tree limbs, shaking down more of the dew. The forest was almost too quiet. The panting of the pack seemed very loud. Beyond the clearing came a thrashing of leaves and the sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot. The bitter smell was suddenly very intense. The moths abandoned their mad cavort and fled silently. The leader barely had time to growl a warning. A nightmare vision burst through the trees nearest the leader. There was a glimpse of red, nearly phosphorescent light set in a head that looked as if it had been crushed, wide and flat with an impossibly long jaw bristling with rows of knife-edged fangs. Fangs that the fledgling recognized as the same one that hung on the leader's necklace. Below, two sets of reptilian, Long-fingered claws flailed. The thing moved on its thick back legs, larger by far than any of the pack, its stout body armored with beaded hard scales. The muscular tail whipped around it, tearing into the undergrowth. It saw the pack, shrieked thinly and charged. A fierce blow of the claws raked the leader's shoulder, and she yelped in dismay. She crouched, ready to attack, but was obviously overmatched. A blur of motion passed her. The fledgling had begun to move from the first sight of the apparition, powered by the first law. Another robot, patterned after the moral codes of Homo sapiens, might only have restrained the creature, but the fledgling was already adopting the mental patterns she had seen in her humans. She was a carnivore, a hunter. She slammed into the side of the thing as it ready to snap at the leader. Powerful as the beast was, its strength was overmatched by the robot's, and her new form seemed admirably suited to complement her mechanical power. Her teeth clamped down on the beast's arm and twisted savagely. The thing bellowed in pain and reared back. Still, the creature was too large, too bulky. A flick of its arm threw her off as it roared in fury. The huge mouth opened, giving off a stench of ancient rotting meat. The beast snapped at the fledgling, but she had already moved. As it turned to find her, she leapt again, this time at the long neck of the beast. She hesitated as her jaws closed around it, but already the others in the pack were attacking. If she hesitated, if she waited any longer, they might be injured. She put pressure on her jaws and felt the windpipe collapsing beneath her crushing jaws. The beast fell, choking. The rest of the pack swarmed the body, tearing at it. All but the leader. Panting, she regarded the fledgling, and there seemed to be a little sympathy in her stance. The forepaws were braced, as if she were waiting for an attack. The dark lips were drawn back slightly from the gums to reveal the ivory teeth, and the low, relentless growling came from her throat. The fang at her neck swung softly from side to side. The fledgling didn't move. It seemed best to stand absolutely still. The leader's icy stare remained on her for long seconds, while the rest of the pack ripped apart the body of the reptilian beast, while they were formed into a ragged line, while the younglings were strapped back on into the travoy. At last the old one barked a query. The leader seemed to ponder what had been said. Then her gaze moved away from the fledgling, almost disdainfully. She padded back to the head of the pack and howled. They readied themselves to move on again. This time the youngling meat carriers waited for the fledgling to go first. The pack left her a space well up toward the leader. The old wolf creature moved alongside her. Just before they left the clearing, the old one pointed at the tattered body of the reptile. "Heringa," he said throatily, then repeated the word. "Heringa." The fledgling spoke the strange word, also pointing. "Heringa, reptile creature." The old one nodded. His eyes, rheumy and bloodshot, narrowed with pleasure as the pack began to move again. By the time the pack stopped to sleep in the morning, the fledgling had learned several more words. Thank you for enjoying, and have a good day. Bye!